The courthouse steps gleamed under the morning sun as Pamela Richardson adjusted her navy suit jacket and checked her watch. As the head of the city's most influential law firm, she had built her reputation on winning cases that others deemed impossible. Her firm represented the wealthy elite, the corporate giants, and the politicians who shaped the city's destiny. Today, she was meeting with the city council to discuss new legislation that would further cement her clients' interests. Across town, in a cramped legal aid office, Mamadou Traoré was reviewing case files that told a different story. The immigrant, lawyer from Mali, had arrived in the city 5 years ago with nothing but his legal degree and an unshakable belief in justice. His clients were the forgotten ones, undocumented workers, struggling families facing eviction, and small business owners crushed by corporate giants. His office walls were covered with thank you letters written in dozens of languages, each one representing a victory against overwhelming odds. The two lawyers had never met, but their paths were destined to cross. Pam's firm had just taken on Meridian Development Corporation as a client. Meridian wanted to demolish the Riverside District, a working-class neighborhood where many immigrant families had built their lives. The company planned to construct luxury condominiums and high-end shopping centers, promising to bring prosperity to the area. What they didn't mention was that this prosperity would come at the cost of displacing 3,000 residents. Traoré first learned about the development project when Maria Santos, a single mother of 3, burst into his office in tears. She clutched an eviction notice in her trembling hands, explaining that her family had lived in their small apartment for 12 years. Her children attended the local school, she worked at the neighborhood market, and her elderly mother lived just 2 blocks away. The notice gave her 30 days to vacate, citing eminent domain and urban renewal. As Traoré investigated further, he discovered that dozens of families in Riverside had received similar notices. The city council had fast-tracked the approval process, claiming the development would create jobs and increase tax revenue. However, when Traoré examined the public records, he found irregularities in the approval process and evidence that proper community hearings had never been held. Meanwhile, Pam was orchestrating the legal strategy for Meridian Development. She had identified potential challenges to the project and was working to eliminate them before they could gain traction. Her team had prepared comprehensive briefs, arguing that the development served the greater public good and that the displaced residents would be fairly compensated. She scheduled meetings with city officials, ensuring that all necessary permits and approvals were secured. The first sign of trouble came when Traoré filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the Riverside residents. His legal challenge questioned the validity of the eminent domain proceedings and argued that the city had violated federal laws requiring meaningful community input. Pam received the lawsuit documents on a Friday afternoon, and she immediately recognized the potential threat to her client's timeline and profits. That weekend, Pam worked tirelessly to craft a response that would dismiss Traoré's lawsuit as quickly as possible. She researched his background and discovered his relatively recent arrival in the country and his small legal aid practice. In her mind, this was a David and Goliath story, but she was confident about which side would prevail. Her firm had resources, connections, and decades of experience in complex real estate law. Traoré spent the same weekend in Riverside, meeting with families who would be affected by the development. He listened to their stories, documented their ties to the community, and began building a case that went beyond legal technicalities. He understood that this fight was about more than property rights. It was about preserving a community where people had built their lives and supported each other through hardships. On Monday morning, both lawyers prepared for what would become a battle that would test not only their legal skills, but also their fundamental beliefs about justice and power. Pam saw the case as a business matter requiring efficient resolution. Traoré viewed it as a fight for the soul of the community he had come to love. Neither could have predicted how their confrontation would expose the deep cracks in the city's legal system and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about who the law truly serves. The courtroom was packed on the day of the preliminary hearing. Judge Margaret Holloway, a veteran of 25 years on the bench, surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. On one side sat Pam Richardson, flanked by 4 associates from her firm, their briefcases arranged in perfect order. On the other side, Mamadou Traoré sat alone at his table, a single worn leather bag containing all his materials. Behind Traoré, the gallery was filled with riverside residents. Elderly couples held hands nervously. Young mothers bounced babies on their laps, and teenagers translated whispered conversations for their non-English-speaking grandparents. The contrast was stark: designer suits versus work clothes, polished confidence versus anxious hope. Pam rose to address the court. First, her presentation was flawless, delivered with the polish of someone who had argued hundreds of similar cases. She explained that Meridian Development had followed all proper legal procedures, that the city had conducted required studies, and that the project would benefit the entire community through job creation and increased tax revenue. She presented thick binders of documentation, architectural renderings of gleaming new buildings, and economic projections showing millions in potential revenue. When she addressed Traoré's lawsuit, Pam was dismissive but professional. She argued that his clients had been given proper notice, that fair compensation was being offered, and that the city's eminent domain authority was clearly established by law. She suggested that prolonging the legal process would only delay the economic benefits that the development would bring to the area. Then it was Traoré's turn. He stood slowly, gathering his thoughts as he looked at the faces in the gallery behind him. When he spoke, his accent was slight, but his voice was clear and strong. He began not with legal precedents or technical arguments, but with stories. He told the court about Maria Santos, who had transformed her small apartment into a home where neighborhood children gathered for homework help. He spoke of Mr. Chen, who had built his corner grocery store into the heart of the community, where people gathered to share news and support each other during difficult times. Traoré then shifted to the legal arguments. He had discovered that the city's community impact study was incomplete, failing to adequately assess the displacement of residents and the destruction of social networks that had taken years to build. He argued that the federal laws requiring meaningful community participation had been violated, as most residents had never received proper notice in their native languages about the hearings that determined their fate. As Traoré spoke, Pam noticed something she hadn't expected. Judge Holloway was listening intently, occasionally taking notes. The residents in the gallery sat in rapt attention, some wiping away tears as their lawyer gave voice to their fears and hopes. Even some of the court staff seemed moved by his presentation. The hearing stretched longer than expected as Traoré presented evidence that the city's approval process had been rushed to accommodate Meridian's development timeline. He showed that alternative sites had been dismissed without proper consideration, and that the promised affordable housing for displaced residents was vaguely defined and inadequately funded. Pam found herself in an unfamiliar position. Usually, her opponents were other corporate lawyers arguing over contract terms or regulatory compliance. Traoré's approach was different. He was weaving together law, community advocacy, and moral arguments in a way that was compelling but difficult to counter with traditional legal strategies. During a brief recess, Pam's associates whispered among themselves, suggesting that they might need to adjust their approach. One junior lawyer mentioned that Traoré's arguments about community impact might resonate with the judge, who was known for her attention to detail and fairness. Pam dismissed their concerns, confident that legal precedent and established procedure would prevail over emotional appeals. When court resumed, Judge Holloway announced her decision on the preliminary injunction. She would allow the case to proceed to full trial, finding that Traoré had raised legitimate questions about the approval process that deserved careful examination. However, she would not halt the development entirely, instead ordering that no demolition could begin until the legal issues were resolved. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Residents erupted in cautious celebration, understanding that they had won a reprieve, but not final victory. Pam's face remained composed, but her associates could see the tension in her shoulders. This was not the quick dismissal they had expected. As the courtroom cleared, Traoré was surrounded by grateful families thanking him in multiple languages. Across the aisle, Pam gathered her materials with mechanical precision. She had underestimated her opponent and the power of his arguments. This case would require more resources and a different strategy than she had initially planned. Outside the courthouse, local news crews interviewed both lawyers. Pam delivered polished sound bites about the importance of economic development and legal procedure. Traoré, surrounded by his clients, spoke passionately about community rights and the responsibility of the law to protect the vulnerable. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and both sides understood that the real fight was just beginning. The phone call came at 7 a.m, jarring Pam from her usual routine of reviewing briefs over coffee. Richard Blackwood, senior partner at her firm and the man who had built the practice into a powerhouse, was calling from his vacation home in the Hamptons. His voice carried the weight of 40 years in corporate law and barely contained frustration. Meridian Development's CEO had called him personally, expressing concern about the delays and negative publicity surrounding the Riverside project. The company had invested millions in planning and preliminary work, and their investors were growing nervous. Blackwood made it clear that Pam needed to resolve this situation quickly and decisively. The firm's reputation and future relationship with major corporate clients were at stake. After the call, Pam sat in her corner office overlooking the city's financial district, contemplating her options. She had built her career on being the lawyer who never lost, the one who found solutions when others saw only problems. But Traoré was proving to be a more formidable opponent than she had anticipated, and his grassroots support was growing stronger each day. Meanwhile, in Riverside, Traoré was experiencing pressures of his own. His small legal aid practice was struggling to handle the increased workload of the class action suit while maintaining his other cases. He had been working 18-hour days sustained by strong coffee and the determination of his clients. His assistant, Elena, had been fielding calls from reporters, community organizers, and other lawyers offering help. But Traoré remained, focused on the legal preparation. The community support was both inspiring and overwhelming. Maria Santos had organized a neighborhood committee that met weekly in the basement of St. Michael's Church. Families brought homemade food to share while discussing fundraising efforts and media strategy. Mr. Chen had placed a donation jar in his store, and even customers with limited means contributed what they could to support the legal fight. Pam decided to escalate her approach. She scheduled meetings with city council members, arguing that the prolonged legal battle was damaging the city's business climate and deterring other developers from investing in urban renewal projects. She presented economic studies showing the potential tax revenue loss from delays, and suggested that settling with a small group of holdouts was preferable to risking the entire development. Her strategy began to show results when Councilman Robert Hayes, who had initially supported fast-tracking the project, called for a closed-door meeting with other council members. Hayes had received several calls from business leaders expressing concern about the precedent that a successful challenge to the Riverside development might set for future projects. Traoré learned about the political maneuvering from Father Miguel Rodriguez, the priest at St. Michael's Church who had become an informal advisor to the community. Father Rodriguez had connections throughout the city and heard whispers about behind-the-scenes pressure being applied to resolve the case in Meridian's favor. The priest warned Traoré that the opposition had resources and influence that extended far beyond the courtroom. The pressure campaign intensified when the city's largest newspaper, the Metropolitan Herald, published an editorial criticizing the delays in the Riverside development. The editorial argued that well-intentioned but misguided legal challenges were preventing necessary urban development and perpetuating urban blight. While the editorial didn't mention Traoré by name, its message was clear. His lawsuit was an obstacle to progress. Traoré responded by organizing a community forum at the local high school, inviting residents to share their stories and concerns. The event drew over 300 people, including families from Riverside and supporters from other neighborhoods who saw parallels to their own struggles against gentrification. Local television stations covered the forum, broadcasting emotional testimonials from residents who feared losing their homes and community networks. The media attention brought unexpected support. Professor Sarah Williams from the university's law school contacted Traoré, offering to help with research and to provide student volunteers for case preparation, a housing advocacy group donated funds for expert witnesses, and a retired federal judge offered to review Traoré's legal briefs pro bono. Pam watched these developments with growing concern. What had begun as a straightforward real estate dispute was evolving into a broader conversation about development, displacement, and community rights. The narrative was shifting in ways that favored Traoré's position, and public opinion was becoming a factor that could influence the legal proceedings. She decided to try a different approach, reaching out through intermediaries to suggest a settlement conference. If Meridian could offer enhanced compensation packages and guarantee affordable housing units in the new development, perhaps the most vocal opponents could be satisfied without derailing the entire project. When the settlement offer reached Traoré, he called a community meeting to discuss the proposal. The offer was substantial: increased relocation payments, priority placement in affordable units, and job training programs for displaced workers. Some families were tempted by the financial security the offer represented, while others remained committed to fighting for their right to stay in their current homes. The community debate was intense and emotional. Elderly residents spoke about the difficulty of starting over in unfamiliar neighborhoods. Parents worried about disrupting their children's education and friendships. Young adults who had grown up in Riverside questioned whether they would ever be able to afford returning to the transformed neighborhood. After hours of discussion, the community reached a decision that surprised even Traoré. They would continue the legal fight, but they also wanted to propose alternatives. Instead of blocking the development entirely, they would push for a modified plan that preserved some existing housing while incorporating new construction that served a range of income levels. This compromise position created new challenges for both lawyers. Pam had to convince Meridian to consider modifications that would reduce their profit margins while still moving forward with development. Traoré needed to refine his legal arguments to focus on inadequate community input rather than opposing all development. The case was evolving into something neither lawyer had anticipated when it began. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Martinez, Traoré's overworked assistant, was organizing case files late one evening when she noticed something odd about the timeline of city approvals for the Riverside development. Cross-referencing dates with her meticulous case notes, she discovered that several crucial permits had been approved before the mandatory public comment period had officially ended. When Elena brought this discovery to Traoré the next morning, he immediately understood its significance. This wasn't just a procedural oversight. It was evidence that the city had predetermined the outcome of the approval process, making a mockery of the community input requirements. The residents' voices had never truly mattered because the decisions had already been made. Traoré spent the weekend diving deeper into the city's records, following a paper trail that revealed increasingly troubling patterns. Planning documents showed that city officials had been meeting privately with Meridian Development for months before the first public hearing. Email exchanges, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, revealed discussions about managing community concerns and expediting the approval process. The most damaging discovery was a memo from Deputy Mayor James Morton to the Planning Commission, explicitly stating that the Riverside project was a priority initiative that should receive streamlined consideration. The memo was dated 3 weeks before the first community meeting, making it clear that public input was never intended to influence the final decision. Armed with this evidence, Traoré filed an amended complaint that expanded his legal challenge beyond eminent domain to include violations of due process and constitutional rights to meaningful participation in government decisions. The new evidence transformed the case from a dispute over property rights into a broader question about democratic governance and government accountability. Pam learned about the new evidence when her paralegal delivered the amended complaint to her office on a Monday morning. As she read through Traoré's findings, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest that she recognized from her most challenging cases. The evidence was compelling and potentially devastating to her client's position. More troubling was the possibility that her own firm might have been aware of some of these irregularities. She immediately called an emergency meeting with Meridian's executives and city officials who had been involved in the approval process. The conference room atmosphere was tense as Pam explained the legal implications of Traoré's discoveries. If the evidence supported claims of predetermined outcomes and due process violations, the entire approval process could be invalidated, forcing the city to start over with genuine community involvement. Deputy Mayor Morton shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Pam outlined the potential consequences. He insisted that the city had followed proper procedures, but his explanations sounded increasingly hollow when confronted with the documentary evidence. Meridian CEO Thomas Walsh was more direct. He wanted to know whether the project could still move forward and what it would cost to make the legal problems disappear. Pam found herself in a difficult position. Her professional obligation was to represent her client's interests, but the evidence suggested that those interests had been pursued through questionable means. She had built her reputation on winning cases through superior legal strategy, not by participating in schemes that undermined democratic processes. Meanwhile, news of the new evidence was spreading throughout Riverside. Father Rodriguez announced, "The developments during Sunday Mass and the community meeting that week was the largest yet." Residents who had been wavering in their support for the legal challenge were energized by proof that their suspicions had been correct. The system had been rigged against them from the beginning. The story gained traction in local media when investigative reporter Marcus Thompson obtained copies of the internal city documents. His series of articles in the Metropolitan Herald revealed the extent of behind-the-scenes coordination between city officials and Meridian Development. The same newspaper that had previously criticized delays in the project was now questioning whether the approval process had been corrupted. Public pressure intensified when the state attorney general's office announced that it was reviewing the Riverside approval process to determine whether any laws had been violated. Community advocacy groups from across the state rallied to support the residents, seeing the case as a test of whether ordinary citizens could challenge powerful development interests. Pam's firm faced its own crisis, as partners questioned whether their association with the controversial project was damaging the firm's reputation. Several junior associates expressed concern about working on a case that involved potentially illegal government actions. The firm's pro bono coordinator pointed out the irony that they were fighting against community rights while simultaneously promoting their commitment to public service in marketing materials. The pressure campaign against the residents also intensified, but it took more subtle forms. Several residents reported visits from city inspectors who found violations in properties that had passed previous inspections. Maria Santos received a notice that her son's school district assignment might change due to administrative restructuring. Mr. Chen faced additional scrutiny from health department officials regarding his store's food handling procedures. Traoré recognized these tactics as attempts to intimidate his clients into abandoning their legal challenge. He documented each incident and prepared to file additional complaints about government harassment and retaliation. However, he also understood that not all families could withstand the pressure, especially those with immigration concerns or economic vulnerabilities. The situation reached a tipping point when Councilman Hayes, under increasing public scrutiny, announced that he was calling for a full investigation into the approval process. Hayes had received hundreds of calls from constituents demanding answers, and his political survival depended on distancing himself from what was becoming a public scandal. As winter approached, both sides prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive phase of their legal battle. Traoré had evolved from a lonely legal aid lawyer into the leader of a movement that had captured regional attention. Pam faced the most challenging case of her career, one that was testing not only her legal skills, but also her fundamental beliefs about the role of law in society. The stakes had grown beyond a single development project to encompass questions about power, democracy, and justice that neither lawyer could have anticipated when their confrontation began. The depositions were scheduled to take place in the conference room of Pam's law firm, a deliberate choice designed to demonstrate power and intimidate the opposition. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city's skyline, while original oil paintings and mahogany furniture projected an aura of established authority. Pam had used this setting countless times to overwhelm opponents during negotiations, but today felt different. Traoré arrived early, carrying his weathered leather briefcase and accompanied by Elena, who had become indispensable in managing the complex case. He took in the opulent surroundings without visible reaction, understanding that the display was intended to remind him of the resources arrayed against him. Instead of being intimidated, he felt a familiar determination that had carried him through previous challenges in his life. The first deposition was with Deputy Mayor Morton, who arrived flanked by the city attorney and 2 assistants. Under oath, Morton attempted to maintain that all procedures had been followed properly, but Traoré's methodical questioning exposed contradictions between his testimony and the documentary evidence. When presented with emails showing his coordination with Meridian executives before public hearings, Morton's composure began to crack. Pam watched the deposition with growing unease. Morton's evasive answers and obvious discomfort were creating a record that would be difficult to overcome in court. Worse, his testimony was revealing details about the collaboration between the city and Meridian that even she hadn't known about. She began to realize that her client had not been entirely forthcoming about the extent of their behind-the-scenes activities. The deposition of Meridian CEO Thomas Walsh was even more damaging. Walsh was accustomed to boardroom negotiations where everyone understood the unspoken rules of corporate deal-making. Under Traoré's patient questioning, he casually admitted to conversations with city officials that had never been disclosed in public records. When asked about his understanding of community input requirements, Walsh dismissed them as bureaucratic formalities that shouldn't interfere with beneficial economic development. During a lunch break, Pam pulled Walsh aside for a private conversation. She explained that his cavalier attitude toward legal procedures was creating serious problems for their case. Walsh, however, seemed unconcerned, suggesting that political connections and economic pressure would ultimately resolve any legal difficulties. His confidence struck Pam as both naive and dangerous given the evidence that Traoré had assembled. The afternoon session focused on the Planning Commission's approval process. Commissioner Janet Riley, who had chaired the meetings that approved the Riverside development, was visibly nervous as she took the witness chair. Under questioning, she revealed that the commission had received guidance from the mayor's office that the project was a municipal priority. When Traoré presented emails showing that the commission's vote had been scheduled before the public comment period had ended, Riley's testimony became confused and contradictory. As the depositions continued over several days, a pattern emerged that even Pam couldn't ignore. City officials and Meridian executives had orchestrated a process that gave the appearance of community involvement, while ensuring a predetermined outcome. The residents of Riverside had been invited to participate in hearings that were essentially meaningless theatrical performances. The most dramatic moment came when Traoré questioned Planning Director Robert Chen about the community impact assessment. Chen had signed off on a report claiming that displacement would be minimal, and that adequate affordable housing alternatives existed. Under oath, however, Chen admitted that he had never personally visited the Riverside neighborhood and had relied entirely on information provided by Meridian's consultants. When Traoré asked Chen to identify specific affordable housing alternatives that would be available to displaced residents, Chen struggled to provide concrete answers. His responses revealed that the adequate alternatives cited in official reports were largely theoretical or located in distant neighborhoods with poor public transportation connections. Pam found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending a process that appeared increasingly indefensible. During her cross-examinations, she attempted to shift focus from procedural violations to the broader benefits that the development would bring to the city. However, her questions seemed to highlight rather than minimize the disconnect between official justifications and actual impacts on residents. The tension in the room escalated when Traoré began questioning the city attorney about legal advice given to officials during the approval process. The city attorney claimed attorney-client privilege for many communications, but the selective assertion of privilege created the impression that there were conversations too damaging to reveal publicly. During an afternoon break, Pam and Traoré found themselves alone in the conference room as their respective teams gathered documents and prepared for the next session. The formal courtroom dynamics fell away for a moment as they faced each other across the polished table. Pam spoke first, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there at the beginning of the case. She suggested that they both understood how these situations typically resolved, through negotiated settlements that allowed all parties to claim partial victory while avoiding prolonged uncertainty. She hinted that Meridian might be willing to make substantial concessions if the legal challenge could be resolved quickly. Traoré listened respectfully, then responded with quiet intensity. He explained that this case had never been about money or personal victory for him or his clients. The residents of Riverside were fighting for something more fundamental: the right to be heard, the right to participate meaningfully in decisions that affected their lives, and the right to trust that their government would treat them fairly. As their conversation continued, the philosophical differences between their approaches became clear. Pam viewed the legal system as a mechanism for managing competing interests and reaching practical compromises. Traoré saw law as a tool for protecting democratic principles and ensuring that power couldn't simply override the rights of ordinary citizens. The moment was interrupted when their teams returned, but both lawyers understood that they had reached a point where their personal confrontation mirrored the larger conflict between different visions of justice. The remaining depositions would determine not just the outcome of their case, but which vision would prevail in the courtroom where their battle would ultimately be decided. The final trial took place in Judge Holloway's courtroom on a cold February morning. Word had spread throughout the legal community about the case that had evolved from a routine development dispute into a test of democratic governance. The gallery was packed with Riverside residents, law students, community activists, and reporters who understood they were witnessing something significant. Pam delivered her opening statement with the polished professionalism that had defined her career. She acknowledged the procedural irregularities that had been revealed during depositions, but argued that they were minor technical violations that didn't invalidate the project's fundamental merits. She painted a picture of economic opportunity, job creation, and urban renewal that would benefit the entire city. Her presentation was logical, well-structured, and delivered with confident authority. When Traoré rose to address the jury, the contrast was immediately apparent. He began not with legal citations but with a simple question: what does it mean to live in a democracy? He spoke about his own journey from Mali, where he had witnessed what happened when ordinary people had
no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives.
He had come to America believing that democracy meant something different, that every citizen's voice mattered, that power was accountable to the people, and that the law existed to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Over the next 3 days, both lawyers presented their evidence methodically. Pam focused on the economic benefits of development and the city's legal authority to pursue urban renewal projects. Her expert witnesses testified about property values, tax revenue, and job creation potential. She argued that the residents' concerns, while understandable, shouldn't override the broader public interest in economic development. Traoré's case centered on the systematic violation of residents' rights to meaningful participation in government decisions. He called residents as witnesses, allowing them to tell their own stories about community bonds, family networks, and the practical difficulties of forced relocation. His expert witnesses included urban planners who testified about the importance of stable neighborhoods and constitutional law scholars who explained the requirements for due process in government decision-making. The most powerful moment came when Maria Santos testified about what the Riverside neighborhood meant to her family. She described how neighbors had helped her through her husband's illness and death, how the community had supported her children's education, and how local businesses had extended credit during difficult times. When she spoke about the fear of losing these connections, several jurors wiped away tears. Pam's cross-examination was professional but seemed to miss the emotional core of Santos's testimony. She asked about compensation amounts and relocation assistance programs, treating the displacement as a practical problem with technical solutions. Her questions inadvertently highlighted the disconnect between bureaucratic processes and human experiences. The testimony of city officials was more challenging for Pam to manage. Under cross-examination, Deputy Mayor Morton's credibility crumbled as inconsistencies in his testimony became apparent. Commissioner Riley broke down completely when confronted with evidence that she had voted to approve the project before reviewing public comments admitting that she had felt pressured to support a decision that had already been made by higher officials. Judge Holloway maintained strict control over the proceedings, but it was clear that the revelations were troubling to her. During one sidebar conference, she expressed concern about the cavalier attitude toward legal procedures that had been displayed by city officials. She reminded both lawyers that courts existed to ensure that government power was exercised according to law, not according to political convenience. The trial's climax came during closing arguments. Pam made a passionate plea for practical compromise, arguing that perfect procedures shouldn't prevent beneficial outcomes. She suggested that the violations, while regrettable, were not intentional and didn't change the fundamental value of the development project. She urged the jury to focus on the future benefits rather than past procedural mistakes. Traoré's closing argument was quieter, but more intense. He walked to the jury box and spoke directly to the 12 citizens who would decide the case. He explained that they were not just deciding the fate of one development project. They were determining whether the law would protect ordinary people's right to be heard by their government. Then came the moment that would be remembered long. After the trial ended, Traoré turned to face Pam directly across the courtroom and spoke the words that had given the case its name. Without the people, without their voices, without their meaningful participation, you have no law. You have only the exercise of power without legitimacy. Pam responded immediately, her voice sharp with frustration built up over months of legal combat. Without us, without the lawyers and the experts and the officials who understand how systems work, you have no justice, only chaos and good intentions. The exchange electrified the courtroom. Judge Holloway called for order, but the fundamental conflict between their worldviews had been laid bare. Pam saw justice as something that required expertise, resources, and institutional knowledge to achieve. Traoré viewed justice as something that emerged from genuine democratic participation and respect for individual dignity. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. They found in favor of the Riverside residents, ruling that the city's approval process had violated constitutional requirements for due process and meaningful community involvement. They ordered that the entire approval process be restarted. With genuine community participation and independent oversight, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Residents embraced Traoré and each other, crying and laughing in relief and celebration. Maria Santos hugged her children, telling them in Spanish that their home was safe. Mr. Chen shook Traoré's hand repeatedly, thanking him in Mandarin and broken English. Across the aisle, Pam gathered her materials with mechanical precision, her face composed but her hands trembling slightly. The verdict was a professional defeat, but it was also something more, a rejection of the worldview that had guided her entire career. In the weeks that followed, the Riverside case became a model for community advocacy throughout the state. Traoré's legal aid practice grew as other communities facing similar challenges sought his help. He used the publicity to push for legislative reforms that would strengthen community participation requirements in development decisions. Pam took a 3-month sabbatical after the trial, the first extended break in her 20-year career. When she returned, she surprised her partners by taking on pro bono cases for the first time, including legal challenges to predatory lending practices that had devastated working-class communities. The Riverside development was eventually approved, after a genuine community planning process that resulted in a mixed-income project that preserved existing affordable housing while adding new construction. The process took 3 years instead of 3 months, but the result was a development that served both economic development goals and community needs. Years later, when law students studied the Riverside case, they learned about more than legal procedures and constitutional requirements. They learned about 2 different conceptions of justice, one based on expertise and efficiency, the other rooted in democratic participation and human dignity. The case demonstrated that the law's power ultimately derives not from institutions or expertise, but from the consent and trust of the people it claims to serve.